last time, I think it was the last time I was teaching this class, Patsy had mentioned for me to come down here instead of being up there. So I said, we'll figure out how to do it. So I had James devise me a new little stand here that I could put all my junk on. Did an excellent job. Like I told him, I had my garage door open and somebody came in and slapped a bunch of maple syrup all over it, and it just really looks bad, but it's functional. I'm gonna be doing some things different than I've done in the past. Last 2 or 3 classes I've done, I've extensively used these PowerPoints and pretty much read off of those, and that was my outlines. So what I've done this time, and what I really would like to do, is develop the outlines on paper and just use these things in a minimal method as I can. Just pretty much give some highlights and then go with it, so that I'm more attuned to the congregation instead of looking this way at the PowerPoint. So let's see how that works out. So what I'm challenged with is having to read from the Bible and from my notes and dealing with bifocals. So I'm not sure how this is going to work out, but we shall see how it goes. The book that we've got is a commentary and notes, or Bible study notes and comments by David E. Pratt on 2 Samuel. If you haven't got one, they're in the back of the room back there. The reason why I decided to do this is I was probably halfway, maybe 3/4 of the way through this book when I decided, hey, this is probably a good thing to use. It gives just some thoughts, comments as we go, as he goes through the book, and it's very easy to follow. And sometimes he throws out some good ideas that shows a little bit about the nature of the book, kind of in his own comments. So what I would recommend doing is read the chapter in your Bible 2 or 3 times, kind of get the feel of what's happening, and then take his book and read it, and read that chapter. It only takes about 30 minutes to go through one of the chapters. So my notes will be taken from the book itself. I will be, utilizing his thoughts into my notes, and then I'll kind of branch off with some things I like to throw into it. This kind of works good for me because the last time I used, I think it was Harkrider's book on Romans, I got kind of frustrated because he had a train of thought that he was following, and a lot of times I thought we needed to go this direction. And so I was fighting the book and fighting my own thoughts. And I think this book kind of goes the same way I want it to go. So anyway, that's the concept there. I won't be reading from the book in the class, probably not much, but I expect you to take it home and read it and utilize it to the best of your ability at home. If we run out, I can get some more. So anybody got any questions on that? Okay, Ronnie reminded me this morning that he does have one mistake, and I think it was in chapter 1, when he refers to Samuel and it should be Saul. Everybody makes mistakes, and there's a few typos in the book, so as far as I know, that's the only mistakes that he makes. But this book is not very in-depth. It's easy to read, and it's not something that you have to have a college education to understand. So with that said, there's a couple of things I want us to know before we get started in this class. My intent is to try to have my notes and the PowerPoints available on our website before each class. And then after the class, I'm recording it. My intent is to upload that to YouTube and then have all of this linked to our website. Now, if you remember, or if you do take the time to look at our newsletter that I send out every Saturday, there's on the second page, there's a section called Auditorium Bible Class 2 Samuel. There's 2 links to it, resource link and class videos. And if you click on the resource link, it'll take you to the web page, and the resources that I've uploaded there, I know you can really read that, but this is what it looks like. What it comes down to is that I've got several commentaries that are uploaded and are available for you to use. David Pratt in his book quotes 2 or 3 of them throughout the book. So I said, well, it might be good to have that up there. So they're there, and then underneath that, there's some books about the life of David himself. Now, these books are about 100 years old. From my research, trying to find books on the life of David, you'd be surprised there's nothing out there. There's a lot of books that takes his life and then makes applications, but to really dig down into who David was, you have to go back and look at these guys that did that kind of research 100 years ago. These guys were the scholars. So I've got 4 or 5 books that are up there, and then there's a link to the class handouts, which is that little thin book. If you don't like my small print that's in black and white, you can get the large print in color from there. And then there's a link to the class videos. Now, if you click on the video link, it takes you to this page. And at the top, it has a link back to the resources, but you'll see it also has what will happen. I'll start populating this with the class videos, and you'll be able to see the video. You'll have a link to the notes and then a link to the PDF slides. So if you're interested in all of that, it's there. And probably the easiest way to access it is through that newsletter. If you don't, just come down here to that bottom picture and just click on it where it says video teaching and follow the links. You'll find it. Any questions about that? Good. 2 Samuel. Now, David was an interesting character. And when I say interesting, David lived during a time that was quite different from the kind of life that we live today. And I think you will see that as we go through this book. Janelle had asked me, she said, why do you want to study 2 Samuel? I said, well, why not? Like I said, I had read through his commentary, and my intent was to do 1 Corinthians, but that kind of bombed out. After about 40 pages of notes, I was beginning to think, I'm only on chapter 4 now, and I've got to do something a little different, because this is not going to be acceptable to the class. So I've kind of backburnered that for the moment, and I'll pick that up after we do this study. But 2 Samuel deals with the life of David from the time that after Saul's death and to the time that David was just about to die. His death happens in 1 Kings chapter 2. So we see in this particular book the reign of David, and that's what we're going to be taking a look at. Now, when we talk about Bible history, someone had said that we have about 52% of the Old Testament is history, and 58% of the New Testament is history. And if God did not want us to study history, why did he give us so much for us in the Bible to study? And I think the reason behind that is that Paul had said things were written beforehand were written for our understanding and for our learning. And so we have that before us. We have not only history, but we have poetry, we have books of wisdom, and we have the prophetic books. History is a very good book for us to read and understand. Now, the time in which David lived was a hard time. There's no any other way I can say that. David lived during the time of the last judge of Israel. That was Samuel. He was born during Samuel's lifetime. He was anointed by Samuel. Samuel died in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And we see, with that said, David's life began at the time after the book of Judges. Now, Judges was a rough book. You know that there was a lot of bloodshed and a lot of wars and a lot of battles. This was after Joshua had already conquered the land through battles and bloodshed when they took possession of the land. So David's life was not like the life we live today. David's life was a life of hardship, where life was, what's what I'm looking for? Life was, you could be alive today and you could be dead tomorrow. And David was raised wasn't raised, but David was a warrior, and he knew what it was like to kill people. Now, to put this into perspective, we see in 2 Samuel chapter 5 that he began to reign when he was 30 years old. Now, he was anointed king of Judah in chapter 2 when he was 7.5 years before. So that means he was about 22 years old. He was anointed king, I think people that did all the math, when he was about anywhere from 14 to 16 years old. After that, maybe shortly after that, he killed Goliath and beheaded him, probably the first man he ever killed. Now, put that in perspective. 18 years old, you killed your first man. And then we see from there until he was about 22 years old, he was running from Saul, having to fight battles. And by the time he was 22, here he is now a king. He's the leader of an army. And why I bring all of this out is what 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1 says. And now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites. That kind of puts into perspective what David was having to do, was slaughter his enemies. And that's an interesting word to put, because it shows us the hardship that David had to face. He didn't have comforts, and he didn't have an easy way of dealing with his enemies. He had to take the sword to them. So, David was a man that had to face reality early in life, and being a king at 22 years of age, and then a king of the whole nation at 30, he had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. Now, the state of Israel. The kingdom itself was united under Saul. Now, there was maybe some contention there, but it was united under Saul. After Saul's death, the kingdom was divided. The southern nation anointed David as king. The northern nations, Abner had taken Saul's son. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I'm going to butcher these people's names, so get ready for it. He took his son, Ishbosheth, and made him king over the northern tribes, so the nation was divided. It was only after that king's death that the nation became united again under David, only to be divided again after the death of Saul. So we see, some issues here. And we'll see also in this book that David in the southern kingdom and this bishop under the leadership of Abner, the captain of the army of the northern nation, they fought each other. Not only were they divided as a nation, but here was brother against brother fighting each other. It was a civil war, so to speak, in Israel, the time that David was living. Now, to understand David, we have to understand 1st and 2nd Samuel together with the Psalms. We see in 1 Samuel where David was anointed king. He found Saul's favor, and then he fell out of favor with Saul. He was running from Saul. His life was constantly being sought by him to be put to death. We see David fighting battles, and we have victories. We find him in despair. And then we find him in the United Kingdom, trying to lead his people. We see the sins that he's committed, and we see his greatness. And we see the life in these two books. We see the man living. But when you take the Psalms, we see the heart of the man. And when you take the Psalms and you start putting the particular Psalms into the life of David where they were written, you see that when he was in despair, he reached out to God. When he was victorious, he gave God the glory. When he sinned, he humbled himself before God and begged for forgiveness. We see that in the Psalms. So it's interesting that to find the life of David, you have to understand the two books and then put the Psalms on top of it, and you have the man, David. Wish we could do that in this class, but we're not going to do that. We're specifically going to be looking at how David reigned as a king, as a man. Now, 1 Samuel, we see his actions and attitudes as a youth inherited to the throne. 2 Samuel, we see the challenges of his actions, and in Psalms, we see David's heart, his integrity, and his love towards God. Now, understanding the events. The main, to be able to understand this book, and we're going to be spending a lot of time on this as each class progresses, is that we have to identify the main characters of the chapters that we'll be studying. We're going to be looking at the ongoing conflict between the house of Saul and David. We'll see the nature of the unified nation, and maybe to some aspect, we're going to be seeing how the application of the law of Moses was or was not made during David's reign. And then we're going to see how well David raised his children. You know, in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 7, the law said, teach your children diligently. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lay down, and when you raise up. Instruct your children. That was the desire of the law of Moses. And we'll see how well David did that throughout this book. In fact, you're probably going to see how well it happened as we go through this introduction. So a brief outline of the book. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this. We'll just recognize that there's three aspects of this book. We see in chapters 1 through 10, David's rise to power. We see in chapters 11 and 12, his sin with Bathsheba and the consequences of that sin. And then we see in chapters 13 through 19, his resulting troubles. And then this kind of carries on out through the end of the book. So I should put that down to 20, because I think it's 24 chapters. Which means that we're going to have to probably hit one chapter a class lesson, so we're going to be going through it kind of fast. So we see, kind of give you an idea, I found this on the internet and couldn't find out if it was copyrighted or not, so I kind of sat down and built my something similar to it. But if you were to look at the length of the bottom of the pyramid, we see the reign of David. And then we see the rise of David. We see that he rose politically, spiritually, and militarily. And then we see that his adultery was at the pinnacle of his reign. And then from there, everything just cascaded downward. So we see the consequences of his sin. So this kind of encompasses David's reign. Troubles in his house and troubles within his kingdom. Now the genealogies, everybody's going to love this. If you can't see this, I'm sorry. We'll be talking more about that as we go through these two little charts. We have to understand the genealogy of the house of Saul, and we have to understand the genealogy of the house of David, because this is very important on how 2 Samuel is laid out for us. When we look at the house of Saul, let me see if I can get this to work right. Let's see. When we look at the house of Saul, we see a few interesting things here. We see Saul's house over here, and then we see his, let me back up. His father was Kish, his father's brother was Ner. So Abner would be Saul's nephew. I think, I'm not sure how, whether he's a nephew or a cousin, I don't know. But Abner is a very important person. He plays a very important role in this book. Saul had a wife and he had a concubine. His wife was Ahinoam, and his concubine was Rizpah. Ahinoam had Jonathan, Abinadab, Malachishua, Ishbosheth, Ishva, and he had two daughters, Michael and Merab. Now, with his concubine, he had two sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth. His nephew Abner, and Abner had a son, Joasiel. This was the house of Saul. Now, when we go to the house of David, his father Jesse, let's see, through David's mother, had this particular genealogy shows his brothers, and by an unknown wife, he had two sisters, Zeruiah and Abigail. Zeruiah had Joab, Abishai, Asahel, and Abigail, with her husband Ithra, had Amasa. Now David had 8 wives and 10 concubines. He had Michal, Abidal, Abigail, Ahinoam, Agiah, Haggith, Bathsheba, and Maacah. Now, Michal was barren, and through his 8 wives, he had Shephatiah, Daniel, Ammon, Ithream, Adonijah, Solomon, and Absalom, and one daughter, Tamar. We don't know who the sons and daughters were through the concubines. Now, his sister had Joab, which was David's army's general, Abishai, and Asahel. And we'll see how all this plays out here in just a moment. So this is important to understand because these are very important characters. Now, taken into the house of Saul, let's go back and take a look at that. Saul had 1 wife and 1 concubine. Through his wife, he had Jonathan, Abinadab, I'm not going to rename them. But out of his sons, 3 of them were killed at Gilboa in the last battle with the Philistines, along with their father Saul. So Saul, 3 of his sons, was killed there. Ishbosheth reigned as king over Israel for 2 years, and he was murdered by Rechab and Baanah. Ishvi, we know nothing about. Could be he died young in life, we don't know. Of his daughters, David's wife, Michal, had no children. And Merab was promised to David when she was married off to somebody else. So when we look at the house of Saul, we see that it was pretty much decimated. God had told Saul because of his transgressions that the kingdom would be taken away from him and no one of his house would reign upon the throne of Israel. And we can see that that was taken care of here. Now, of his concubine, he had 2 sons. These 2 sons were executed by the Gibeonites, along with the sons of Merab. We'll talk about. She had 5 sons, and they were executed by the Gibeonites. And the reason because of that is because of Saul's transgression against them by going against the promise that Joshua had made to those people. They required his blood. So when it comes down to it, his sons, of his wife, and his concubines were destroyed. The only remaining descendant that we see in the 2 Samuel is Saul's grandson, Mephibosheth, which was Jonathan's son. Okay, everybody got that? Okay. The house of David. Oh, okay. Now, Saul's uncle Ner had 2 sons, Abner and Jaasiel. Abner, which was Saul's cousin, was murdered by Joab, David's nephew, because he killed his brother Asahel. Does that make sense? Okay. Abner was killed by David's nephew for the reason that Abner had killed his nephew's son, his brother. So again, we see not only was Saul's house devastated, we now begin to see his uncle's house was also being taken care of. Saul's cousin, Jaasiel, was a leader of the tribe of Benjamin during David's reign. I guess he was the only one that had enough sense to say, hey, let me back off here and you guys deal with this. I'll just do what I need to do and stay out of everybody's way. Now the house of David, as we saw, had 8 wives, 10 concubines. Michal had no children. We see Shephatiah and Daniel, and there's a possibility that these 2 may have died young in the age, as we shall see as we go through the book. When we see his other sons trying to usurp the throne from David, he's kind of done so in the manner of oldest down to the youngest. But Ammon, one of his sons, was killed by Absalom because Ammon had raped Absalom's sister, Tamar. Okay, I had Abigail on the top of my head. Adonijah was executed by Solomon, his half-brother, for trying to usurp his throne, as you read about in 1 Kings chapter 1 and 2. Bathsheba had Solomon. Maacah had Absalom and Tamar. Absalom was executed by Joab, David's nephew, for trying to usurp the throne. Of course, we know what happened to Tamar. David had two sisters, Joab, David's army general. He was executed by Solomon. Abishai, we don't know any children of him, or her children was unknown. Zebediah was a commander of David's army. He commanded 24,000. And Amasa was Absalom's army general. He was murdered by Joab, his cousin, for being commander of the army of Absalom, trying to usurp David's throne. Was a threat to his own power and had to be put in the fear of being replaced as commander of David's army. So, with all of that said, let's kind of sum it all up. Saul's son died. Okay? We see that in the end of 1 Samuel, and we see it throughout 2 Samuel. And we see Abner was also killed. His death was in 1 Kings chapter 2, I believe. And in David's house, we think that the first two may have died early. We don't know. But we see Ammon had died. We see all the deaths here. Now, the thing that we have to see in all of this is that these half-brothers were killing each other. That's the thing that we need to look at. This was David's house. Now, if David had followed the example set forth, or the command set forth in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house and walk by your way, when you lay down and when you rise up. If they would have been taught that diligently and had understood it, we wouldn't have seen the rape of Tamar, we wouldn't have seen the murders of each of these people against themselves, and we wouldn't have seen his sons trying to take his throne away from him. So I asked the question, how much did David really know about the law of Moses? You know, when we see David trying to put the ark on a cart and move it, I think that's in chapter 6 of 2 Samuel. If he had known the law, why would he have done that? Now the next question is, if the nation itself would have known the law, why would they have permitted David to have done that? See, they had come out of the judges. They had, Eli, one of the judges, was corrupt. Samuel had corrupt sons. And at the death of Samuel, where did the nation lay as far as the law went being taught to each other? So in conclusion of all of this, we have some basic deductions that we need to look at. The character of David's family. We will see that they were guilty of murder, which was out of anger, revenge, or lust for power. We see that we had rape, the lust of the flesh. We see that there will be deceit for personal gain and glory. And we see David's hesitance to punish his sons for their actions. Now we're going to see this early on. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. When the Amalekite come to David and said, I killed Saul, David was not hesitant to say, you by your own admittance that you killed him, even though I think he was lying to David, you raised your hand against God's anointed, he had him put to death. When the two men that killed Abishboth brought his head to David and said, look, we have killed your enemy, the family that sought your death. Here's his head. David said, you murdered an innocent man, and he immediately had them executed. Now, when his sons start killing each other, what do we see? Do we see a king executing the judgment of the law, or do we see a king that is in agony over the actions of his sons and his love for his family? So again, I say, what do we know about the life of David? When I look at all of this, I still have a lot of questions. I see David torn between executing himself as a king over the nation and torn with the problems existing in his own family and how he deals with that and how this would affect his standing before the people as a king. So, what do we deduce? David had a lot of problems. That's what I see. David had a lot of anxiety. He had a lot of depression. He had a lot of issues. He had a lot of problems. Ruling as a king, dealing with a family that was. So, what did he do? He allowed violations to the law of Moses by not punishing his sons. There were laws about what happens if you seduce a virgin. There were laws about killing someone innocently, but he did not follow them. So, the law of Moses was explicit. We see all of these different verses we can go back to and look at from the law of Moses. It tells how to deal with these things. But we do know that the Bible says that David was a man after God's own heart. He had problems, he had things he could deal with, he probably didn't know how to deal with, much like everybody else in this room this morning. But when it was all said and done, go look at the Psalms and you see the heart of David. He was a man after God's own heart, but he had trouble dealing with his life. And that's an important thing for us to remember. We can have problems. We may have difficulty. We may not do things right. We may stumble and do things wrong. But if our heart is right, striving to do what God wants us to do, no matter how much of the law we know, if our heart is in tune with doing what God wants us to do, we are men after God's own heart. We see that he was not faultless. When he recognized his sin, he corrected it. And when God punished it, we see that he bore it with humility. This is the heart of David. He did what God told him to do, and he considered it with great importance in his life. So how well did he know God's law? And I've said this before, and I think this is one of the passages that you need to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this particular book. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 17 through 18, it says, "Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest he turn his heart away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. And it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, then he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priest, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and to observe, and careful to observe the words of this law and his statutes." To my knowledge, none of the kings of the Old Testament, both in Judah or Israel, we are told, ever sat down and copied the law and read from it every day of his life. We're not told that. And when I see with David trying to move the ark on a cart, it pretty much tells me that David probably didn't do this. Don't know why. He may have, I don't know why. If he didn't, I don't know why, unless the priest at that time were not fully aware of this requirement of the king and brought it to his attention. I may be wrong in all this. This is just an assumption. But when I see things happen in David's life and some of the mistakes he made in reference to the law of Moses, it kind of makes me think that he didn't do this. Whether he did or not, I don't know, so don't quote me on that. But it's something to keep in the back of our mind. Now, it doesn't mean that David was ignorant of the law. He knew, it was being taught. I guess he may have heard it, read to him and being taught as he grew up, enough to where he had faith in God and that there was no doubt in his mind that the laws that Moses had laid out for them was the law that they should follow. And because of that, I think his faith was enough to be able to say that he was a man after God's own heart. So, am I giving you a gloom and doom picture of David here? Did you ever consider this when you were looking at David's life or reading 1st, 2nd Samuel? When you read these books, you say such and such killed such and such person. You just kind of read and go right on along with it. But when you look at who these people actually were, then it begins to settle into your mind. This was a rough bunch of people. And as you will see, when David kills Amalekite and kills Baana and the other fellow that killed Ishbosheth, he calls for the young men to do the execution. And I got to thinking about that. Why did he call the young men in both of these cases to do the dirty work? I think it was because a person that was older and battle hardened, I mean, it was just like tying his shoelaces to cut the guy's head off. You know, just nothing to him. But take a young man that was maybe 16, 18 years old, that maybe had not seen battle. David was showing them this is what it's like to kill someone that is in violation of God's law, that kills innocent men. Learn what it's like to take a life. Because this is where, if you're going to be in the army, this is where it's going to lead you to, is that it's going to be commonplace to you. It's going to be like putting your shoes on, it's going to be like combing your hair to take a person's life. And he had to teach them that lesson early. Now, look at your own families. If you had a son that was, let's say, 18 years old, can you see him killing people? Can you see your son at 22 years of age, 23, becoming a leader of a nation, and at 30 leading the whole nation? And even between 16 and let's say 20, when the people were saying Saul killed his thousands and David killed his tens of thousands, what does that tell us about David? In his youth, he did a lot of killing. It was to him second nature. It was a way of life. And we should not take that lightly, I think, in our studies. But we also see David, you know, sticking to principles in a lot of cases. You know, this is the way things need to be. Now, as far as taking 8 wives and 10 concubines, neither shall he multiply wives for himself. You know, that's an interesting comment. He shall not multiply wives. Now, how many is too many?
Ask Solomon.
You know, realistically, I was kind of looking at this on the internet, seeing what, you know, some of the Jewish people said. Actually, they used David's life as the gauge. They said that 18 was the max. Actually, 17 is safe. And that's another thing too. You know, when you look at Saul, he had 1 wife and 1 concubine. To me, that's probably 1 too many to begin with. But David's life with 8 wives and 10 concubines, how did Solomon look at this? Okay? Have as many as I want. I can have as many horses as I want. I can marry women of other countries. I don't think Solomon knew just what God had said in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Now, I'll leave this one last point. When we are told in the old law that you're to sit down and teach your families at night, when you got 8 different households over here and 10 over here, how well could David sit down and teach his sons when they're scattered like that? If you all got them together every day in one place, what do you think would happen? I think there would be rivalry to no end. Anyway, that's the introduction. We'll do 1 Samuel chapter 1, Wednesday night.